This isn't just a crime story. It's a story about power and what happens when power never has to answer. Jeffrey Epstein is gone, but the system that protected him is still standing. Some people lost everything. Others lost absolutely nothing. This video isn't about rumors. It's about records. It's about outcomes. And it's about why justice doesn't always look the way we expect it to. Because when the most powerful case in America ends quietly, the real question becomes, who actually faced consequences and who never had to? The Epstein files aftermath. Who faced consequences and who didn't? The files were unsealed. The names were whispered. But the real shock, how little actually changed. When people talk about the Epstein files, they often imagine a single moment. A vault opening, secrets spilling out, powerful figures exposed overnight. But the truth is far more disturbing, because when the Epstein files surfaced, the world expected justice. What it got instead was silence, delays, legal language, and unanswered questions. This is not just a crime story. This is a story about power, protection, and consequences that never came. The illusion of accountability. Jeffrey Epstein's crimes were not hidden in darkness. They were reported, investigated, and partially prosecuted years before his death. And yet, for decades, he moved freely, flying on private jets, hosting elites, donating to institutions, and maintaining relationships with influential figures across politics, finance, academia, and royalty. So when the Epstein files began re-entering public conversation through court documents, depositions, and unsealed records, many believed this time would be different. But here's the uncomfortable reality. Being named in a document is not the same as being charged. Association is not the same as guilt, and influence often determines outcomes more than evidence alone. This is where the aftermath truly begins. What the Epstein files actually are. The phrase Epstein files does not refer to one single document. It includes court filings from civil lawsuits, depositions, and testimonies, sealed and later unsealed court records, media investigations based on verified sources. Many names appear not as defendants, but as people mentioned by witnesses. Individuals referenced in travel logs, contacts in Epstein's network. That distinction matters legally and ethically. Some names were cleared quietly. Others were never officially questioned. And a few were protected by the system itself. Who faced consequences? In the aftermath, only a limited number of people faced direct legal consequences. Jeffrey Epstein himself died in custody before trial, leaving no verdict and no full courtroom exposure. Ghislaine Maxwell, his associate, was convicted on federal charges related to trafficking minors. One of the few definitive legal outcomes tied to the network. But beyond that, no sweeping arrests, no cascade of indictments, no public reckoning matching the scale of the allegations. This gap between expectation and reality is what fueled global outrage. Why so many faced nothing at all? There are three critical reasons. 1. Statute of limitations. Many alleged crimes occurred decades earlier, making prosecution legally impossible. 2. Lack of direct evidence. Civil testimonies can expose patterns, but criminal cases require proof beyond reasonable doubt. 3. Power structures. Elite legal teams, political connections, and institutional caution slowed or stopped momentum. This is not conspiracy. It's how high-level legal systems often function. The public reaction for the public. The aftermath felt like betrayal. People didn't just want punishment. They wanted truth. They wanted transparency. They wanted confirmation that no one is above the law. Instead, they saw redactions, closed-door settlements, careful wording, and media fatigue. The public believed the story ended with Epstein's death. But what if the real protection didn't end there? What if the most powerful names never needed a courtroom because the system itself worked for them? Behind sealed settlements, quiet exits, and legal loopholes. A second story was forming, one the files only hinted at. And once you see how justice was legally avoided, you'll understand why some people were never meant to be questioned at all. How power escaped accountability. Justice didn't fail loudly. It failed quietly. No dramatic verdicts. no televised trials, no final list read aloud in a courtroom. Instead, what followed Jeffrey Epstein's death was something far more unsettling. A procedural disappearance of responsibility, buried under legal language, sealed agreements, and institutional silence. And once you understand how this happened, the question stops being who was involved. It becomes who's ever reachable. The legal firewall that changed everything at the center of Epstein's aftermath sits a single, controversial mechanism: non-prosecution agreements and sealed settlements. Years before his arrest in 2019, Epstein had already negotiated legal protections that were unusually broad. These agreements didn't just resolve his own exposure, they limited how far investigators could go, even when new information emerged. After his death, this structure became even more powerful, because without a living defendant, many civil cases collapsed into settlements, and criminal inquiries lost momentum. Courts required defendants. Prosecutors need targets, and Epstein, legally speaking, was no longer one. The result, a system designed to process cases had nothing left to process, who faced consequences, and what that actually meant. Some individuals did face consequences, but not in the way the public often imagines. Epstein's estate paid financial settlements to victims. Institutions cut ties, issued statements, or restructured quietly. Professional relationships ended without explanation. But notice what's missing. No sweeping indictments. No cascade of resignations. No public trials revealing networks or The consequences were administrative, not judicial. Reputational, not criminal. Financial, not legal. For many, accountability came in the form of distance, not discipline. Where the story turns darker, here's where the aftermath becomes more disturbing. The same systems meant to protect victims' confidentiality clauses, sealed records, victim privacy laws, also limited public visibility. This created a paradox. The more the legal process moved forward, the less the public could see. Court filings were redacted. Depositions were sealed. Settlements closed doors instead of opening them. And in that darkness, speculation flourished, while facts remained locked away. Justice wasn't denied. It was processed out of sight. Why, some names never reached a courtroom. Many people expected a wave of high-profile prosecutions. That wave never came, not because allegations didn't exist, but because evidence standards in criminal court are unforgiving. Civil cases require probability. Criminal cases require certainty. After Epstein's death, witnesses had no defendant to confront. Evidence chains became harder to prove. Jurisdictional barriers slowed cooperation. Prosecutors don't pursue cases they can't win, especially against powerful defendants with elite legal defense. So what looked like protection was often prosecutorial reality. But that explanation didn't satisfy the public, and it still doesn't. The role of silence became the loudest outcome of all. Not press conferences, not disclosures, not clarity, just time.
Time passing.
Institutions moved on. News cycles shifted. Legal documents gathered dust. And slowly, the question changed again. From who escaped accountability to was accountability ever designed for cases like this? Seamless bridge forward. What followed Epstein's death wasn't justice or injustice. It was absence. An absence of trials. An absence of transparency. An absence of answers. But that absence didn't happen by accident. It followed a pattern, one built long before the case became global news. A pattern shaped by money, legal architecture, and quiet agreements that never expected public scrutiny. And once we examine how protection is constructed before scandals even surfaced, the aftermath stops being confusing and starts making sense in a way that's far more uncomfortable. Because the real story isn't about who walked free. It's about how walking free was built into the system from the very beginning. The power structures that never went on trial, the most powerful force in the Epstein aftermath wasn't a person. It wasn't money. It wasn't influence. It wasn't even silence. It was structure. Because long before headlines exploded, before courtrooms filled, before the public demanded answers, The outcome was already being shaped by how power moves when no one is watching. And once you see those structures clearly, you realize something chilling. Some systems aren't designed to deliver justice. They're designed to absorb damage. How institutions protected themselves first after Epstein's death. Attention briefly turned toward institutions. Organizations, financial entities, social circles, and professional networks that had crossed his path. What followed wasn't chaos. It was coordination. Statements were released. Internal reviews were announced. Policies were updated. On the surface, it looked like accountability, but underneath, something else was happening. Institutions weren't investigating truth. They were managing exposure. Legal teams moved faster than journalists. Compliance departments acted before courts. Public relations strategies were deployed before facts were settled. The goal wasn't to uncover everything. The goal was to contain the blast radius. The quiet power of distance, one of the most effective tools in the aftermath, wasn't denial, it was distance. Connections were reframed as brief. Associations were described as casual. Interactions were minimized, contextualized, or forgotten. And legally, this matters. Criminal law doesn't punish proximity. It punishes participation. So, the further someone appeared from direct involvement, the safer they became, even if their names surfaced in discussions, records, or reporting. Distance became protection. Ambiguity became armor. Where the illusion breaks, here's where the story sharpens. While public focus stayed on who, the real game was being played around how. How decisions were made, how documents were categorized, how timelines were framed. Because when power is threatened, it doesn't panic. Files move slowly. Reviews take months. Committees replace individuals, and responsibility dissolves into layers so thick that no single hand ever appears on the lever. That's not a conspiracy. That's bureaucracy, doing exactly what it was built to do. Why transparency had limits, many asked why everything wasn't simply released. Names, records, communications. The answer lies in law defamation standards. Contractual confidentiality. These aren't loopholes. They're legal pillars. And in cases involving wealth and influence, those pillars don't collapse under pressure. They hold. Even when information exists, releasing it can expose institutions to lawsuits, financial penalties, or reputational damage. So transparency became selective, enough to appear responsive, not enough to be revealing. The public's frustration, and why it grew as months passed, frustration turned into suspicion. People weren't just asking what happened, they were asking why nothing happened, and that's where the disconnect formed. The public expected justice to behave emotionally. The system operates clinically. Justice doesn't rush. It doesn't satisfy. It doesn't explain itself. It processes. And in hyper cases, processing can look indistinguishable from protection. When accountability becomes abstract by now, Epstein himself was no longer the center of the story. He had become a symbol, a stand-in for a larger fear. That accountability weakens as power increases. That justice has ceilings. That truth has limits. That some outcomes are negotiated long before anyone votes, protests, or reports. This is where the case stopped being about a single man and started being about trust. Seamless connection forward. What we're left with isn't proof of guilt or innocence. It's something more unsettling. A realization that accountability didn't fail. It transformed. It moved away from courtrooms and into boardrooms. Away from trials and into settlements. Away from public view and into legal silence. And once we follow what happens after attention fades, when headlines disappear and pressure dissolves, a final question remains. What does justice look like when the world stops watching? Because that's where the story truly ends. Or begins. Depending on how closely you're willing to look. When public trust collapsed, not the case. The Epstein case didn't just expose a crime. It exposed a fracture. Not in law, not in evidence, but in public trust. Because after the investigation slowed, after the courtrooms went quiet, after the headlines faded, something far more dangerous was left behind. The belief that the system protects itself before it protects people. And once that belief takes root, it doesn't disappear. How the aftermath changed public perception before Epstein. Many people believed accountability was inevitable, slow, imperfect, but unavoidable. After Epstein, that belief cracked, not because justice failed outright, but because it felt selective. Some consequences were visible. Others were administrative. Most were invisible. And when the public couldn't see how decisions were made, trust didn't just weaken, it evaporated. People stopped asking what happened. They started asking, what are we not allowed to see? The silence that spoke loudest in major scandals. Silence is rarely neutral. Press briefings slowed, updates became procedural, language turned cautious, legal, sanitized. This wasn't confusion, it was containment. Silence became a strategy, because silence reduces liability, limits speculation, and allows time to do its most powerful work, erase urgency. As weeks turned into months, outrage lost momentum, and the absence of new information didn't calm the public. It unsettled them. The moment Ross snapped, here's the moment everything shifted. When people realized the case didn't end with answers, it ended with explanations about why answers couldn't be given. That distinction matters. Justice usually concludes with resolution. This concluded with justification, and justification feels defensive. That's when the Epstein case stopped being about one individual and became a symbol of something larger. How power interacts with accountability when stakes are high. Why institutions prioritize stability over transparency from a system perspective. This behavior wasn't emotional. It was rational. Institutions don't survive by revealing everything. They survive by managing risk. Transparency invites lawsuits. Disclosures invite scrutiny. Admissions invite consequences. So instead, systems defaulted to controlled statements, legal framing, limited disclosures, enough to appear responsible, not enough to create exposure. Two institutions. This is stability. Tout public. It feels like evasion. The long-term damage, no one measured what, no report could quantify, was the erosion of belief. Belief that justice applies equally truth. Eventually surfaces power doesn't rewrite outcomes once those beliefs weaken. People don't disengage quietly. They disengage emotionally. Cynicism replaces confidence. Suspicion replaces patience, and every future case is viewed through the same lens. The Epstein aftermath didn't just close a chapter, it reshaped expectations. Why the story never fully ended. Cases usually conclude. This one lingered, because unresolved stories don't disappear. They echo. They resurfaced in documentaries, debates, leaked documents, and public memory. Not because new facts always emerge, but because closure never arrived. And without closure, the public fills gaps with theories, assumptions, and fear. That's not a failure of the audience. That's a failure of narrative resolution. The uncomfortable truth. The most unsettling outcome wasn't who was punished or who wasn't. It was the realization that justice can be structurally limited, even when laws are followed. No dramatic no single villain. Just systems doing what they redesigned to do. Protect continuity. And that truth is harder to accept than any conspiracy. Seamless bridge forward by now. The Epstein case had done something irreversible. It didn't just raise questions about one investigation, it changed how people interpret power, law, and accountability itself. And when trust breaks at that level, the damage doesn't stay confined to one case. It spreads into how future scandals are judged, how institutions are viewed, and how justice is expected to behave. Because the final consequence of the Epstein files wasn't legal. It was psychological. And once that shift happens, the real impact is only visible much later, when the system faces its next test, and the public is no longer willing to believe the outcome at face value. The real consequence, no one expected the Epstein case. Didn't end with a verdict. It ended with a warning, not written in law books, not announced in courtrooms, but etched quietly into how power now operates, and how the public sees it. Because after everything settled, one truth became unavoidable. The most powerful outcome wasn't punishment. It was precedent. What the aftermath ultimately changed. After the headlines faded and the filings slowed, institutions didn't collapse. They adapted, legal frameworks were reinforced. Risk management became sharper. Exposure pathways were mapped more carefully. From a systems perspective, this wasn't failure, it was learning. The lesson wasn't don't get caught, it was don't become visible. And visibility, not guilt, became the real liability. Why future cases will look different. The Epstein aftermath quietly reshaped how high-profile cases are handled. Settlements happen faster, disclosures are narrower, legal language is tighter, accountability is diffused not because justice disappeared but because control improved. Cases are now designed to end cleanly, not loudly, and clean endings don't leave evidence trails for public debate. The shift no one noticed, here's the shift most people missed. Power didn't become stronger after Epstein, it became more careful, which is far more effective. Influence stopped being obvious. Associations stopped being documented. Protection stopped being reactive and became And when power plans ahead, accountability arrives too late to matter. Why the public still feels unsettled. Years later, people still talk about the case, not because of new facts, but because closure never arrived. There was no moment where the story resolved emotionally, no final explanation, no shared understanding, no collective exhale, just an ending shaped by procedures, not truth. That absence leaves a vacuum, and vacuums invite speculation, distrust, and fear. What this case revealed about justice. The Epstein files didn't prove the system is broken. They proved something more complex. The system works, just not for storytelling. Justice is not designed to feel fair. It's designed to be defensible. And defensible outcomes rarely satisfy the public's need for meaning. That gap between legality and legitimacy is where trust erodes. The real risk going forward. The danger isn't that people believe nothing. It's that they believe everything is negotiable. When accountability feels optional, trust becomes conditional. And when trust disappears, institutions don't lose power. They lose credibility. That's a far deeper wound. Why this story still matters. This case isn't important because of who was involved. It's important because of what it revealed. How power protects itself, how silence can be lawful, how justice can conclude without feeling complete. These lessons didn't vanish with the case. They became templates. The Epstein files didn't answer every question. They taught us something more uncomfortable. That in a world shaped by influence, the loudest scandals don't end with truth. They end with structure. And once you recognize that pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. Not just in this case, but in every case that ends quietly. Every story that fades without resolution. Every outcome that feels finished, but never feels right. Because sometimes, the most powerful consequence of all is learning how the game is really played. This case didn't end with a verdict. It ended with a lesson. Not about one man, but about how accountability changes when power enters the room. The Epstein files didn't collapse the system. They revealed how it survives. And once you understand that, you stop looking for justice in headlines and start looking for it in what's missing. Because the most dangerous truth isn't what was proven, it's what never needed to be. If this story made you think, make sure to like the channel.